This is episode 128 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, it's post-Labor Day, and now we're getting into prime time in terms of public policy. From here until the holidays, we'll have a lot going on for sure. Although it wasn't exactly a summer off, but now we're in the teeth of things that we're doing. And of course, the legislative session after the new year will only amplify that. But Bernalillo County over the summer did adopt the paid time off ordinance that we warned them it was a bad idea and tried to stop them from doing it. We've talked about that at nauseum, but we brought up some transparency issues at the Rio Grande Foundation in terms of what the commission and the county had been doing in terms of releasing, or more appropriately, not releasing public records like texts sent to commissioners and commissioners sending emails to third-party organizations contacting them one way or the other. And that includes Restaurant Association, Rio Grande Foundation, and various other groups that attempted to reach to the commissioners and let them know their views on the issue. And, quite frankly, we've been working through this IPRA issue with the county for quite some time, and they have not fulfilled our request to the satisfaction of neither the Rio Grande Foundation or the law, and we are suing and have been suing, but we released something specifically saying this is not going away. We're going to continue to be active and engaged on this issue because the ordinance passed doesn't mean the IPRA lawsuit inherently goes away, but we wanted to remind folks of that. And, Bernalillo County is not being very good when it comes to public records, and more on that in a second, but I'll turn it over to you for additional commentary on our friends at Bernalillo County.
Yes. What is interesting, and you alluded to a bit, a lot of organizations sent them a lot of emails expressing their concerns. Now, you weren't asking for your own emails back, but those clearly should have been in the big pile of emails that came back from not only the organizations that made this request, but many others. They didn't even get the ones that came from you, which shows that, Houston, we have a problem, but what are they doing? This IPRA thing that's been around for a long time, this ought to be Governance 101, but has Bernalillo County not been exposed to many IPRA requests, or what is the deal? This is a mighty confusing one.
You got it. And in the direct mail world, and the Rio Grande Foundation does some of that, they call it a dummy address. Not that I was trying to write them myself in an effort to hold them accountable per se. I was trying to actually hope to convince them, even though I didn't expect them to be convinced by, this email from Paul is so well worded. It's so pure. It convinced me. I am going
Jeffersonian in tone.
Abandon my socialist pretensions and instead adhere to what is good for limited government and individual liberty in New Mexico. So I didn't expect that. But when you do send a request and you have personally sent multiple comments to the commissioners themselves, like, you would expect that even if they're not trying, that they should have looked through and said, Paul Gessing, Rio Grande Foundation, let's make sure we send him his own contacts that he's made with the Bernalillo County Commission. Alas,
didn't even do that.
No, not entirely surprising, but we will continue our efforts. And it seems like we're not alone. Because I am in receipt of a letter, possession of a letter, dated August 30th, 2019, so very, very recently, where Attorney General Hector Balderas sent a letter to Ken Martinez, former state legislator and county attorney, because the county has apparently been trying to charge people fees under the state's IPRA law for information that they requested, and it was not appropriate. So while Attorney General Balderas, is not someone that we're thrilled with at the Rio Grande Foundation for his general practices as Attorney General, he did come down on Bernalillo County for their violations of the IPRA law. Hopefully they wise up and go ahead and fulfill our modest IPRA request because it's just ridiculous. And it's not limited to Bernalillo County. Governments across the state of New Mexico don't always adhere to the law when it comes to these kinds of requests.
Yes, and this is not one of those we're requiring them, you're asking them to go dig in the archives, printed records from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. These are predominantly electronic messages recently, and it's still to no compliance. I am reminded of the character Buddy from the movie Elf. The Bernalillo County Commission is on the naughty list, and we'll see how this turns out.
You got it. So more to come on this particular issue. Now, an interesting turn of events, and we certainly don't go into details on all of the Albuquerque Journal's editorials, but film is a special area of interest for the Rio Grande Foundation. And we have, in general, been frustrated by media coverage across the state of New Mexico, but definitely the Albuquerque Journal. They have been very pro-film. They have a reporter, Adrian Gomez, who is almost a PR man for the film industry in our estimation, not doing a lot of hard-hitting or objective reporting. But the editorial board of the Albuquerque Journal, which is generally good. They've been pro-film over the years. But finally, the first chink in the armor, if you will, from the editorial board specifically, taking a closer look at the film industry and the subsidies being offered to that industry in New Mexico. The editorial, very much worth reading. Saturday morning, September the 7th, that's when it ran. A New Mexico Who Spent It. Very tough to make that pun, but they did come up with a pun there relating to the industry. And while they don't necessarily attack the industry and the subsidies themselves, they, like our IPRA request, they have concerns about transparency and openness in government. And, we're spending so much money, as we've cited, we've discussed, on the film industry, an estimated, according to the LFC, $750 million in actual spending on the industry over the next 5 years. Massive quantities of your dollars going out the door of state government to fund this industry. More and more opposition, I do believe, is kind of coalescing. There's been significant issues in terms of reporting the data and what's going on, and just this accountability thing is not really there. And to their credit, the Albuquerque Journal did a very strong editorial on the transparency aspect of the film industry. And, maybe you could get away with that, I suppose, just $50 million annually, not a whole lot of transparency. Now that we're potentially going for a much higher level of film subsidy spending, the industry is going to be held to a higher level. It's that old line about fat cats and, you get eaten when you get too fat. And it's maybe the industry has traipsed into that kind of territory when it comes to our tax dollars. We'll see.
Yeah, the other quaint saying is billions at the federal level, millions at the state level, a million here, a million there, and pretty soon you're talking real money. $750 million, $750 million of spending. direct spending by government, by state government, our tax dollars, you would think some accountability or some higher level accountability would be appropriate. Holding my breath. If you hear my head hit the table at the end of the podcast, that's why. But the journal article also, or editorial, had an interesting quote in it that is it all worth it? ? And other states have found over the years, and the one they cited in their editorial was Louisiana. It wasn't worth it. They said uncle at some point. Will New Mexico do the same? Almost assuredly, but without data, that's a good way, without disclosure, without transparency, sure way to keep it going longer than it would have, even if it isn't a good program for the state.
And I like what New Mexico doesn't have is a dollars in, dollars out transparency tool aimed at the taxpayer to show them their subsidies are worth the cost. Ding, ding, ding. Yes, we have a winner. There is a reason you do not have a dollars in, dollars out subsidy calculator, because any halfway honest attempt to do that would result in horrible numbers for the film industry. Now, we have taken folks to task across the state, reporters especially, for misrepresenting, say, the initial 2014 film study, the Film Office's own study. You can find it on their website, which was portrayed at the time, and the media dutifully reported that there was all this economic impact, but what they didn't report is the 43 cents on the dollar that the subsidies were returning. And that finally kind of coalesced into a couple things happening, which is before the last legislative session, so like November, December of 2018, you had the surprising announcement to some that the state of New Mexico owed these Hollywood filmmakers hundreds of millions of dollars. And then you had the LFC reports after the session saying this is only going to generate 40 or so cents on the dollar. Those kinds of honest discussions, at least, are starting to be had, and it's not just the Rio Grande Foundation equivalent of John the Baptist out in the desert. We've got somebody else there by our side. We'll see if that new guy can get more done in terms of this issue. Of course, with who's in charge in Santa Fe, until the progressives, the left-wingers who don't like corporate welfare, say they don't, who don't like these big businesses getting these extreme benefits from the taxpayer, we are going to be fighting a very uphill battle. Republicans, at least in the legislature, and Governor Martinez as well, were a little more critical of Hollywood. That doesn't mean that you won't find Republicans jumping on board dutifully with Hollywood film subsidies, but the progressive mentality in this state, the folks who control the dollars and cents in Santa Fe, generally speaking, are the biggest boosters of this policy.
Well, and my explanation is if it's an industry that the progressives don't like, something as normal business as depreciation could be considered corporate welfare. But if it's industry they do like, a direct cash subsidy, here, I'll write and hand you a check, is somehow not corporate welfare. Crazy.
Yeah, and I think Wally's making a veiled reference there to the oil and gas and coal industries, which are definitely not fan favorites among many on the left. And there's all kinds of special depreciation incentives created in these federal tax laws. Whether they're good, bad, or indifferent is very difficult to parse out. But what happens is that the left then latches onto these and somehow equivalates them to outright mandates for wind and solar, or direct bottom line incentives paid out to some of these industries, or credits given to these industries. So very different, but it really gets tricky, and that's why you have to pay attention to these kinds of things.
Yeah, and your point is well taken about a lot of times the headlines of these studies is a very different animal than if you read the details of these studies. And reporters in general, there are exceptions, in general do not like numbers.
No doubt about it.
And so they take what is spoon-fed to them more often than they should by both sides of the aisle. They will just take a number and they'll run with it. You know, it reminds me of, the Austin Powers movie, $1 million. It's like, no, that's $1 billion. That's 1,000 million. They're not good with numbers, and you've got to be good with numbers to understand a policy like this one, how good or how bad it is.
Yeah, and to conclude the discussion, that's a big part of what the Rio Grande Foundation does. It's we can come out with a lot of original research telling folks in Santa Fe what to do or not do, but they tend to not be keen to do the things that eliminate special favors in the tax code or given favors that are given to organized labor or some other special interest group. But when it comes to the media and just kind of how they report on these issues and how they skew their coverage, it's something that the Rio Grande Foundation definitely tries to keep on top of. And nowhere have we seen more bad reporting, I think, than the film industry and its subsidies. Something you missed, and this is kind of another role that the Rio Grande Foundation takes on, which is to find stories that are not reported by the media at all. So you have the skewing of the stories, but you also have the just complete missing of stories. And maybe it was about 4 months ago, City of Albuquerque passed a bill, somewhat controversial at the time, that resulted in fees being paid for folks who have apparently particularly grisly or big potential accidents that they have on the roads, that is going to result in some fees being charged. Now, the real situation is not that if you get into a crash, you, John Q. Public, are going to be paying a big amount of money to the city. It is going to be the insurance companies. It's essentially another way for a government entity in New Mexico to fleece an industry, or in this case it's an industry, but oftentimes it's the government, the federal government. But in this case, it was the industry of insurance that's going to be targeted for these fees. And look, it's not good policy. It's not the way things should be done. Yes, I am a firm believer, and maybe, Wally, I don't know about you, but if you go out into the wilderness and you go rock climbing or hang gliding or do something that's inherently dangerous, yes, you should be charged for the cost of having to send 50 people up to find you or your body. That is a reasonable cost, because people do things that are high risk. They should not be burdening average taxpayers. But you're driving down the road and a crash happens and perhaps somebody dies. It's hard for me to say that that's not kind of what emergency services are made for. And anyway, that's not even what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that a component of that legislation was a fire and life safety fee that was also tacked on, that's going to raise over $1 million for the city of Albuquerque.
But it's not a tax.
It's not a tax.
It's not a tax. It
is a fee.
It's a fee. Let's use our best NPR voice. It's a fee.
Yes. So this was implemented and started on July 1st, and the city of Albuquerque is going to be charging businesses and actually smaller businesses fees based on their square footage. If your business occupies up to 500 square feet, the fee goes up 250%. Big businesses like Walmart won't see any increase at all. Medium-sized businesses with square footage between 1,500 and 1 square foot and 3,000 square feet receive a 66% increase. Now, these are not huge fees themselves, but when you increase the fees with very little oversight, raise $1 million, again, per Wally's saying before, which is, I believe, attributed to Everett Dirksen, a famous senator who now has his name on one of the Senate office buildings in Washington, D.C., a billion there or a million there. And pretty soon you're talking about real money in the city of Albuquerque, just nickeling and diming businesses, especially in this case, small businesses. So we just passed the sick leave mandate, and that's in the county, but it's coming to the city. Now we're talking about another tax that's already been imposed in terms of these fire fees. And it's outrageous, and the media needs to do a better job of covering it. I get it. They're undermanned. They're outgunned. They lack the resources as well, and things are getting worse for many media outlets. But that's what the Rio Grande Foundation can also do, which is to shed light, shine some information on these taxes and fees that come out of nowhere that people don't really follow and have a chance to weigh in on adequately.
Yeah, this is a not as business friendly a city or state as the politicians in charge would like to think. And I base that on direct observation and working with a lot of people who bring operations to New Mexico and compare it to other places. We're not the worst, California, but we are certainly not the best from a business friendly point of view. And then when you put these things in that are these kind of hidden charges, it just does not seem like a good way to go about it. And this seems like that's the wave of the future, because raising taxes, even progressives know that gets some pushback, but a fee, that's much different.
Yeah, and the Rio Grande Foundation did blow the whistle. Danny Seymour, who appeared on a recent podcast, wrote an op-ed that appeared in the Albuquerque Journal on Sunday, the 8th. So check that out if you haven't already done so. And you're right. City of Albuquerque is definitely not as business friendly as its leaders seem to want to sell it as. It's amazing they continue to do these anti-business things. And yes, when the economy is great, times are good, they've got money flowing in, everything seems wonderful. But the moment the economy goes down, or you don't have this oil boom in southeast New Mexico that's propping everything up across our state, then they just wonder what the heck is going on, and they don't have really any solutions, because it defies their entire mindset, which is more government is good, more spending is good, more regulations are a necessity, and it really it is very hard, next to impossible, for them to change that direction. So times being good, it's good for all of us, but those government officials, they really skate on the accountability side when times are doing well.
Yeah, and it's one of those, if you say something often enough, pretty soon people will start to believe it. I know some businesses have come to the state. They believed it for their first expansion into the state, but then they said, nope, we're not putting any more. That was just too difficult.
No doubt about it. Well, our friends at the Americans for Tax Reform have a new report. And again, we at the Rio Grande Foundation talk a lot about the size of New Mexico government relative to state economy, for example. And this report is fascinating. So first and foremost, it's available on our website. I went ahead and screenshotted some of the information, errorsoфenchantment.com. You can really dig into the information. But Bureau of Economic Analysis data and National Association of State Budget Officers, so very credible sources used by the Americans for Tax Reform for this particular study. What they did is they looked at all 50 states and ranked them by their size of government, state spending divided by GDP, state economic output. I don't think it's a shock to anybody reading that West Virginia has the biggest government, consuming nearly 25% of the overall state economy in West Virginia, 23.3%. New Mexico at 20.8% of GDP. So New Mexico right there as the second biggest government in the entire country as a state goes. Now, they didn't look at local, to be fair, but state is very critical. Arkansas, Alaska, Mississippi, Oregon, Vermont, Hawaii, Kentucky, Rhode Island round out the top 10. Surprisingly to maybe a lot of folks, Arizona is 16th, so not that small of a government in the state of Arizona. 18th is Oklahoma, which, yes, does neighbor New Mexico just a little. Colorado at 29th, so not very, very small, despite the presence of the Taxpayer Bill of Rights and their limited way that they approach government spending in Colorado, despite being a purple-ish state. Utah, 43rd ranking, and Texas, all the way down, the smallest state government in the entire country, 6.7% consumed out of the state economy as compared to 20.8% in New Mexico. And Wally, before I toss it over to you, I often hear from people who tell me, Texas has high taxes too. Texas does this, that, and the other thing. There's no reason New Mexico isn't as business friendly or as economically prosperous as Texas. And I say, yes, Texas has high property taxes, but they don't tax income, which is the most important thing not to tax.
And they don't tax services with gross receipts tax.
So Texas is doing a lot right. And when you get to spending, and that is really, as Milton Friedman would say, if you want to measure the burden of government, don't just measure taxes, you've got to measure spending. And I'm a firm believer in that. Milton Friedman is one of the smartest people that's ever walked this planet, certainly in the economics field. 6.7% in Texas and New Mexico at 20.8%. So more than triple in New Mexico's government as a percentage of GDP. There's a reason Texas is the economic juggernaut that it is, and New Mexico is not. So what say you, Wally? There's more to this study, but I want to get your comments on that initial part.
Yeah, well, the thing that struck me was the fact that we're number 2, my observations, the fact that the top 5 of government spending are not the states that I would categorize as the cool kids, the states economically you want to be like, West Virginia, Arkansas, Alaska. And then that we're also, in addition to being number 2, we're growing very quickly. We're growing at the second highest rate. So we could be number 1 on this list, but by all outward appearances, this is one of those inverse lists. This means we're second to last on another list here in New Mexico. Now, the way this was put together, obviously, because it's on a spending side, we're number 2. But when you look at state spending as being not a good thing, which I believe it is not in general, this is the bad list. And yeah, Mississippi's right there with us. So just to put that into perspective, New Mexico and Mississippi tend to always be on those bad lists from an economic point of view. And the growth is probably as disturbing as the absolute position we're in, particularly since there's more money coming in. Is that money going to be refunded to the taxpayers in the form of lower taxes or tax restructuring, or is it going to be spent? I have my prediction, but maybe spending is not what we need more of it here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and I'll editorialize on this note. My wife, many of you have met listening to this podcast. She is born and raised from West Virginia. I will always say that New Mexico and West Virginia have a heck of a lot more in common than does New Mexico with Mississippi. There's always that, thank God for Mississippi.
Right.
West Virginia has much, much more in common, including geographical isolation, the mountains, the resource intensity of the economy. Now, West Virginia currently is suffering from challenge that their main natural resource is rapidly going away. Of course, that's coal, whereas New Mexico is in the midst of a boom. And maybe that leads us to this next segment of the Americans for Tax Reform report, which is the fastest growing state governments of the past 5 years. Now, this is 2012 to 2017. I was surprised. Rarely do things in public policy or studies surprise me, but remember, as a percentage of GDP, so as a percentage of the state economy, the state government of New Mexico grew the second fastest 2012 to 2017, with Nevada blowing us out of the water, but Arizona coming in third. Now, the ATR study also looked at the fastest shrinking governments and found that over that same time period, 2012 to 2017, West Virginia's government has actually shrunk quite a bit. So perhaps they are moving in different directions, West Virginia and New Mexico. So you're talking about, first and foremost, Governor Martinez years. Now, we have looked at the data, and on an aggregate level, spending did not explode during the Martinez administration. I think that is safe to say. Our economy also did not explode. In fact, our economy was either stagnant or revenues were barely growing during that time period. So maybe that's part of the issue with regard to why New Mexico's government, state government as a percentage of gross domestic product produced in the state grew so fast. But I am going to try to get a hold of the author of this report for the Americans for Tax Reform, and I think we're going to get them on the next interview podcast. So we'll have some more information on this. And of course, Americans for Tax Reform, that's Grover Norquist Group. They do a lot of great work. We'll have a really nice discussion the next time we have an opportunity to sit down and really pull this study apart, because fascinating stuff. All right, Wally, we are moving onward and upward. And speaking of growing governments, although this is back to the taxation side of things, not the spending sort of side of the issue, it was put forth this week in the media that despite the record revenues that we've been talking about almost every week now at the podcast, New Mexico's top state income tax rate is set to rise in 2021 from 4.9% to 5.9%. Wally, what in the heck is that all about?
That is my question to you, Paul. Absolutely need to do some digging into the details. My suspicion is that so much of the government largesse at the state level flows through the permanent funds, in particular the land grant permanent fund, that maybe this calculation about revenues didn't even include the land grant permanent fund. It was all sources, because I was frankly shocked to see that. So it's like, if the rate could go up during these government revenue times that we're going through now, where they're just absolutely exploding, how on earth did that happen? And that's the only even hypothetical. Have you had a chance to look at the details enough to figure that out, Paul?
Yeah. So I don't exactly remember all the details, but there was a revenue trigger, state revenue trigger in HB 6. That is the bill that in 2019, this session was passed, signed into law, raised a variety of taxes, online sales taxes that you're now paying, vehicle purchase fees, etc. There was some targeted tax cuts, predominantly at theoretically low income working families, et cetera, the kind of stuff that if a tax cut or any kind is going to happen with the progressives in charge, it's going to be very narrowly targeted at these most economically struggling demographics. But so there was a trigger in that bill, and it had to do with how fast state revenues were growing. Now, state revenues, as we've said, if you factor in oil and gas, and I don't think it really matters if it's oil and gas or not oil and gas, seems like it's growing very, very fast across the board. I mean, the general fund, we know, is going to be close to $8 billion next year. So the Albuquerque Journal reported that this revenue target has not been achieved. Now, most people, when it's bill passed, said, yeah, that's going to result in a tax increase. But Dan Boyd at the Albuquerque Journal on September the 3rd. Actually, it'll be the 4th, Wednesday the 4th, when this story came out. New top New Mexico tax rate likely to go into effect. And it says it'll hit the books in 2021. Again, 5.9%. So Richardson took us down from 8.2. Richardson in the legislature at the time, still controlled by Democrats, took us down to 4.9 over a few years from 8.2. It has been a cause celeb among the far left in the legislature, just showing you how far left today's Democrats are in New Mexico compared to the Richardson era. They have been trying very hard to push back on this, and with the progressives in charge now, they are taking that top income tax rate to 5.9%. So we're not back to the bad old days of 8.2, and it does apply to higher earners, folks that make more than $210,000 annually. But it is also worth noting, Wally, that as the Tax Foundation states, nearly 70% of American businesses are called pass-through, meaning that they pay taxes under the individual tax code. So successful small businesses that make in excess of $210,000 a year, those folks will be taxed on this earning at a higher rate. So yet another anti-small business tax. Of course, wealthier people will see higher tax burdens as well. So really, no amount of money ever makes you safe in New Mexico when it comes to the grasping hand of government.
Yeah, and then the other issue with regard to this, because of how income taxes work, is there's a huge incentive to put any oil and gas job in Texas that can be done in Texas because they don't have income tax. And so now New Mexico's, there's so much going on. We're starting to see some operational facilities be built in New Mexico because of the intense volume of activity that's going on down there. But in the words of the, and I don't know if he was a great judge when he was a federal appellate judge, but as Judge Learned Hand said, and this is something that I remember from my days back at the Cal College there in Las Cruces, is that anyone may arrange his affairs so that his taxes may be low as possible. He is not bound to choose the pattern which best pays the treasury, federal or state. There's not even a patriotic duty to increase one's taxes. So that, along with the idea, a bit of the Laffer curve, meaning higher rates don't always bring more revenue in. That's very hard for people to understand. Yes, the rate is higher, but there's a lot of flexibility in any economy at any time, particularly the modern economy today where things can be done on computer networks in lots of different places. Don't think that by raising the rate a lot that you're going to see a lot of additional revenue. You may see some, but it may actually drown out other positive economic activity that would have happened here otherwise, but for this increase in state income tax rate.
Yeah, you're 100% right, especially given New Mexico geography and the fact that the oil boom is happening so close to Texas.
Yes.
It could easily help people make those decisions in terms of where they want to live. I'll speak from personal familial experience. My sister is married to the military, so to speak, and as soon as they got stationed at a military base in Tennessee, that became their home base where they registered and will probably be paying taxes or not paying income taxes for the rest of their experience in the military. And of course, it should be noted that military folk, by and large, are not among the top earners, at least in terms of their incomes. So this isn't about what the top rate actually is. This is the fact that people are sensitive to keeping every dollar they can, as the good Judge Learned Hand said, and not giving government as much of their money as possible. Now, after several trips elsewhere, redeployments and stationing, they are in California, and California does have some of the top rates in terms of income taxes in the entire country. They wouldn't necessarily be paying those, but if you can save the money, you can arrange your affairs to avoid it. Why do you pay higher taxes? Now, that can be very difficult in terms of a country and people moving across international borders. But one of the beauties of federalism, the reason the founding fathers set things up the way they did under the U.S. Constitution, the genius of that system is that you have competing structures of governance. Now, as a libertarian, I'm very much in line with the view that should be much more embraced than it currently is. But in the area of taxation, you do have still a great deal of competition among taxing jurisdictions. And folks are going to want to be in Texas where they don't have to pay that personal income tax. It makes a very big difference to folks. So more bad policy, unfortunately. Wally, before we leave, it cannot be avoided, cannot be left unsaid that President Donald J. Trump is visiting the land of enchantment here and speaking in Rio Rancho at the Rio Rancho Star Center on the evening of Monday, September the 16th. So less than a week away from us. 7 p.m. is the time. You can go to donaldjtrump.com and find tickets. I'm not going to tell people to go or not go. Hopefully the event goes off without a hitch and you don't have, you have, protest, peaceful protest, but you don't have any violence. And that certainly has happened when the then candidate Trump showed up in New Mexico. And we have a lot of people who seem to be prone to violence and rampant immaturity. But it's interesting, Wally, the president has said he wants to win New Mexico. I don't know why, but he does. With all due respect to the state, I mean, we have those 5 wonderful electoral college votes, but the chances, even with the electoral college, I mean, if it wasn't for the electoral college, there's no chance any president will show up here. But he does seem to be putting his time and money where his mouth is and showing up to New Mexico to give a campaign rally. It'll be interesting to see how that is received, how it goes, and what President Trump really does in terms of coming to New Mexico over the next year and a half.
Yeah, candidate Trump did not receive a very good reception, not from those who attended when he was candidate, but the law enforcement and all of that was extremely poorly handled. It will be interesting. That's quite a challenge, and I'm with you. I certainly hope that everyone who wants to rallies, everyone who wants to protest, but that they keep things of the nonviolent nature. We have a right to free speech. We have the right to peaceable assembly, and hopefully those two grand traditions of our Constitution will be at play when the president comes to campaign a week from now.
Well, just thinking through it, kind of far afield, but certainly a very different logistical challenge if you're a police officer dealing with, going out to the Star Center. It's kind of a hike to get out there, not a whole lot surrounding it, whereas downtown Albuquerque Convention Center, definitely a lot more buildings, a lot more places for the crazies to come out and cause troubles. But of course, you have roads that could easily be, blocked off. There's not that many roads to get to the Star Center. So it'll be very interesting.
And security for a sitting president is a whole different beast than for a candidate
very true.
Well. And so, yes, so hopefully there will not be craziness, but it's going to be a different ball game all the way around. And it is very interesting that he's coming here. I think it's one of those, it's like the prize fighter who put his glove on a certain way and always won a big fight. Well, he came to New Mexico, even though we didn't win the electoral votes, and he won. Is that why he's back here? He likes to campaign here. He received a both good and bad reception, depending on whether it was inside or outside of the event when he came here before. And it'll be interesting, and it's nice to see that a person as prominent as the President of the United States is coming to New Mexico. It's fantastic.
Hey, and if you're looking to make New Mexico a little less progressive, a little less blue, having the president top down with his structure in place, hoping to win New Mexico is certainly going to improve your chances of getting a better turnout than 2018 saw. Lastly, I'll be in Carlsbad this week at the Mayor's Energy Summit Energy Resource Summit. It'll be September the 12th, 7:30 to 1 p.m. See a lot of folks, hopefully down in Carlsbad, the heart of the oil boom in New Mexico in that Permian Basin. Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post your comment on this page or this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing the show.